She had worn black for a year. Every morning she had dressed in it, moved through the house in it, eaten her meals in it. Black was honest. Black asked nothing of her. Black did not pretend. Now her stepmother was holding up a pink gown and smiling. Not just any pink. Cecilia's pink. The exact shade Cecilia had worn to the Harrington ball the night the Duke of Wexford had asked to be introduced to her. The night everything had begun. The night everything, eventually, had ended. "You'll wear this," her stepmother said, not a question. Elizabeth Ashwood looked at the dress, then at the pearls laid out beside it, then at the small pot of rose water on the dressing table, Cecilia's scent, the one Elizabeth had never been able to wear without feeling like an imposter. "He knew Cecilia," Elizabeth said carefully. "He knew her face," her stepmother replied. "You have her face near enough, near enough." That was what she had been her entire life, wasn't it? Near enough to be useful, not enough to be chosen. She almost said no. She opened her mouth and the word was right there, solid and final, and then her father appeared in the doorway, and she saw his eyes, and she understood that no was not something she was permitted to say. She picked up the pearls. The carriage smelled like Cecilia. Elizabeth noticed it the moment she stepped in, that faint trace of rose water, of powder, of something warm and soft that had always belonged to her sister and never to her. She sat very straight and kept her eyes on the window and told herself it was only a smell. It meant nothing. Cecilia was gone. The smell was just a smell. The dress, however, was not just a dress. It fit her almost perfectly, which was the worst part. She and Cecilia had been nearly the same height, nearly the same build, nearly being the word that had defined Elizabeth's entire existence beside her sister. Nearly as tall, nearly as pretty, nearly as charming. Nearly, always close enough to draw the comparison, never close enough to win it. She had loved Cecilia anyway. Completely, without reservation, the way you love someone who has no idea they are outshining you, because they are simply being themselves. That was the thing about Cecilia. She had never tried to be the brightest person in the room. She simply was. And now she was gone, 1 year and 11 days, taken by a fever that had moved through her in a single terrible week, and Elizabeth was sitting in her sister's dress, wearing her sister's pearls, carrying her sister's name into the house of the man who had once intended to marry her. Her father had been very clear in his instructions the night before. "Wexford doesn't need the details," he had said, not looking up from his papers. He knew Cecilia socially. He was not present at the funeral. There is no reason to lead with grief. He was her fiancé, Elizabeth had said. He was briefly her fiancé. The engagement ended. He has not been in contact with this family since. Her father had finally looked up. "You are going as a guest, a family connection, nothing more. Let him draw his own conclusions. And if he asks my name, give it. Elizabeth Ashwood is not a lie. It is simply incomplete. Incomplete. Another word that had followed her all her life. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass of the carriage window and watched the countryside flatten into something grander, the hedgerows giving way to open land, to iron gates, to a long drive lined with elm trees standing in the gray afternoon light like sentinels. Wexford Manor. She had never seen it before. Cecilia had described it once, enormous, Elizabeth, and so serious. Every room looks like it's waiting for something important to happen. And Elizabeth had laughed and said it sounded exhausting, and Cecilia had laughed too, and that had been 3 months before the engagement ended, and neither of them had spoken of Wexford again. Elizabeth had never asked why the engagement ended. She had wanted to. But Cecilia had looked in those last weeks like a person carefully not falling apart, and Elizabeth had not wanted to be the one to push her. She wished now, fiercely and too late, that she had asked. She reached for her gloves and noticed for the first time the small bag tucked into the corner of the carriage seat. Cecilia's bag, the cream one with the tarnished clasp, the one she had carried everywhere that last season. Elizabeth's stepmother must have packed it without thinking, or perhaps with too much thinking. It was impossible to know. Elizabeth picked it up. It was light, nearly empty. She opened the clasp. Inside was a single folded letter. The seal had been broken, but it had never been sent. The address on the front was incomplete, only a name, James. Elizabeth's hand went still. James Wexford, the Duke himself. A letter written to him, sealed, never sent. The carriage slowed. Through the window, the manor's front steps came into view, and on them a figure, tall, dark-coated, utterly still, stood waiting. Elizabeth closed the clasp. She did not read the letter. She was not sure she could bear to. But she did not put the bag down either. She held it in her lap as the carriage door opened, as the cold air rushed in, as a footman offered his hand and the world outside became suddenly, irreversibly real. She stepped out. Across the gravel, the Duke of Wexford looked at her. His face gave nothing away. But for one fraction of a second, one brief, unguarded moment that was gone before she could be certain she had seen it, something moved behind his eyes. Not recognition. Something older than that. Something that looked almost like grief. The Duke did not smile. Elizabeth had prepared herself for many things on the drive over: awkward questions, polite indifference, the particular cruelty of a man who looked at her and saw only a poor substitute for what he had lost. She had prepared herself to be overlooked, assessed, found wanting. She had not prepared herself for this. A man who looked at her as though she were a problem he had not expected and did not yet know how to solve. "Miss Ashwood," he said. His voice was low and even, a voice that had learned, somewhere along the way, not to give itself away. "Your Grace," she curtsied. The dress rustled around her, Cecilia's dress, making Cecilia's sound. He said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved over her face with the careful attention of someone who was not being rude exactly, but was not pretending either. Then he said, quietly, almost to himself, "You look nothing like her." Elizabeth felt the words land somewhere behind her ribs. "No," she agreed, "I never did." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, perhaps not ever, but a slight recalibration, as though she had answered a question he hadn't meant to ask aloud. He stepped back and gestured toward the door. "You must be cold. Come inside." The house remembered Cecilia in every room. Elizabeth noticed it the way you notice a smell gradually, then all at once. It was not obvious. There was no portrait on the wall, no monogram on the curtains. It was subtler than that and therefore worse. It was in the flowers. Cecilia had always preferred white flowers, not because she was conventional, but because she said colored ones made her feel crowded. Every vase in Wexford Manor held white flowers. It was in the music on the pianoforte in the drawing room. A particular piece Elizabeth recognized. A simple melody Cecilia had played badly and cheerfully for years. The sheet music still open as though someone had recently turned to it. It was in the book left spine up on the side table near the window, a volume of poetry Cecilia had mentioned in a letter once, saying the Duke had sent it to her. He had not packed these things away. He had not moved them at all. Elizabeth walked through the rooms during the brief tour. Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, a small, precise woman with kind eyes, gave her before dinner, and she said nothing, and she touched nothing, and she understood with a slow, settling certainty that she had walked into a house that was still in mourning. The Duke simply hadn't told anyone. Dinner was quiet. There were no other guests, which Elizabeth had not expected. She had imagined a gathering, safety in numbers, the blessed cover of conversation that had nothing to do with her. Instead, it was just the two of them at opposite ends of a table built for 16, with candles between them and the sound of cutlery that seemed very loud. The Duke was not unkind. He asked about the journey. He asked whether her rooms were comfortable. He asked, with the dutiful politeness of a man who had been raised to fill silences, about the family's estate in Derbyshire. Elizabeth answered everything carefully. Not falsely, she was not lying, she was simply not volunteering. Her name was her name, Her home was her home. Everything she said was true. It was only the shape of it that was incomplete. "You don't eat much," the Duke said at one point without particular judgment. "I eat precisely enough," Elizabeth said. He looked at her. For the first time that evening, something almost human crossed his face. That sounds like something a person says when they've been told they eat too much. Elizabeth set down her fork. It sounds like something a person says when they're sitting across from a duke they met 3 hours ago and would prefer not to be observed quite so closely. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. Then the Duke said, "Fair enough," and returned to his meal. It was not a smile, but it was, Elizabeth thought, the shape that a smile might take in a man who had forgotten how. After dinner she sat in the drawing room alone. The Duke had excused himself, something about correspondence, delivered with the efficiency of a man who had a ready supply of excuses. Elizabeth did not blame him. She was a stranger in his house, wearing his dead fiancé's perfume, and she suspected he needed the walls of his study around him more than he needed company. She sat near the fire and looked at the music on the pianoforte. After a while, without quite deciding to, she reached over and closed it. It felt like the right thing to do. She wasn't sure for whom. She was almost ready to go upstairs when she heard footsteps in the hall, not the Duke's, too light for that, and Mrs. Holt appeared in the doorway. "Forgive me, Miss Ashwood, I thought you'd retired." The housekeeper paused. Her eyes went to the closed sheet music. Something moved across her face, gratitude, maybe, or recognition. "Can I bring you anything?" "No, thank you," Elizabeth hesitated. "Mrs. Holt, how long have you been at Wexford Manor?" 31 years, miss." "Then you remember," she stopped, chose her words. "You remember when my sister visited." Mrs. Holt was quiet for a moment. "I do." "Was she happy here?" The housekeeper looked at her for a long time. Not unkindly. The way a woman looks at another woman when she is deciding how much truth is a kindness and how much is simply a burden. "She was," Mrs. Holt said finally, "for a while." Elizabeth nodded. She did not ask what came after for a while. She was not sure she was ready for that answer yet. "Good night, Mrs. Holt." "Good night, Miss Ashwood." Elizabeth took the candle and went upstairs. In her room, on the bed where her maid had laid out her nightclothes, was Cecilia's bag. She had forgotten it there that morning. She picked it up, held it, put it in the drawer of the bedside table without opening it. Then she lay in the dark of Wexford Manor and listened to the house settle around her, and somewhere down the long corridor a clock struck 11, and she thought about a letter written to a man named James, sealed and never sent, and wondered what it was that Cecilia had needed to say badly enough to write it down and been unable to say at all. 3 days passed. Elizabeth had not expected to settle into Wexford Manor. She had expected to endure it, to move through the days carefully, say the right things, smile at the right moments, and count down to the end of the visit the way you count down to the end of something unpleasant but necessary. Instead, she found herself, on the 3rd morning, standing in the library with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, and a book she had actually wanted to read open on the table before her, and she realized with some alarm that she had not thought about leaving in nearly 2 hours. The library was the one room in Wexford Manor that did not feel like Cecilia. It was all dark wood and tall windows, and the particular smell of books that have been read rather than displayed. The shelves were slightly disordered, not neglected, but used, the kind of disorder that comes from actually looking for things rather than arranging them for appearance. Elizabeth approved of this deeply and had not expected to. She was on her 2nd chapter when the Duke walked in. He stopped when he saw her, not with displeasure, more the mild recalibration of a man who has entered a room expecting it to be empty and found he didn't mind that it wasn't. "Miss Ashwood." "Your Grace," she moved to close the book. "I can find somewhere else." "Don't," he said it simply, without ceremony. "I only came for this." He crossed to the far shelf, retrieved a slim volume, and then, to her surprise, did not leave. He settled into the armchair by the window, opened his book, and began to read. They sat in silence for nearly an hour. It was, Elizabeth thought, the most comfortable she had felt since arriving. It became, without either of them deciding it, a kind of routine. Mornings in the library, reading in companionable silence. Afternoons that varied, once a walk through the grounds when the weather permitted, once a longer conversation over tea that began with the estate's history and somehow arrived, without warning, at the question of whether duty was the same thing as loyalty. The Duke said it was. Elizabeth said it wasn't. Neither of them convinced the other, and both of them seemed quietly to have enjoyed trying. He was not what she had expected. She had built him in her imagination from the wreckage of Cecilia's broken engagement, a cold man, or a proud one, or one of those men who are charming at a distance and impossible up close. She had been prepared for all of these. She had not been prepared for a man who listened, who asked questions and then waited, actually waited for the answer, who had the rare and disarming quality of appearing to find her interesting, not as a woman to be assessed, but as a person who had thoughts worth hearing. It made her more careful, not less. Because every time she felt herself beginning to relax, she remembered the dress, the pearls, her father's voice, let him draw his own conclusions. She was here under false pretenses, wearing her sister's things, and this man had loved her sister, and she was sitting in his library drinking his tea and finding him. She did not finish that thought. On the fourth afternoon, he suggested they walk to the stables. It was a mild suggestion, made in passing, the kind of thing that required no particular answer. Elizabeth fell into step beside him, and they crossed the lawn in the thin autumn light, and she was thinking about something he had said earlier. About the North Field, about a drainage problem, she had been half listening, when they rounded the corner of the hedge and the stables came into view. The smell hit her first, hay and horses and leather. Then the sound, a soft stamping, a low exhale from somewhere inside. She stopped. It was involuntary, a small, embarrassing flinch quickly controlled, but he noticed. Of course he noticed. She was beginning to understand that very little escaped him. He didn't say anything immediately. They walked a little further. He spoke briefly with the groom, and Elizabeth stood at a careful distance and kept her expression pleasant and looked at a point somewhere above the stable door. On the way back to the house, he said, without looking at her, "Your sister never mentioned she was afraid of horses." Elizabeth's heart stopped. "She wasn't," Elizabeth said carefully. "She loved them." "I know," a pause. "I was asking about you." The ground felt suddenly unreliable beneath her feet. She kept walking, kept her voice even. "What makes you think I'm afraid?" "You flinched when we came around the hedge. You stood 12 feet from the door the entire time. You watched the groom the way people watch things they don't trust." He glanced at her then, brief, direct, without apology. "I've seen the expression before. It's not complicated to read." Elizabeth said nothing for a moment. "A childhood incident," she said finally. "It was a long time ago." "These things usually are." He did not push further, but then, quietly, "You could have said so. I wouldn't have suggested the walk." "I didn't want to be managed around." He stopped. She stopped too and looked at him, and found him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful blankness he wore in company, not the quiet attention he had in the library. Something more unguarded than either. "No," he said after a moment, "I don't imagine you would." They walked back to the house in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Something had shifted in it, some small but significant weight had moved. Elizabeth felt it. She suspected he did too. That evening after supper she went to the library alone. She told herself she was going to read. She sat down, opened the book, and read the same paragraph 4 times without retaining a word of it. Then she put the book down, went upstairs to her room, opened the drawer of the bedside table, and took out Cecilia's bag. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. "He didn't fall in love with your sister, Elizabeth. That wasn't true. She didn't know that. She was inventing things because she wanted them to be true, and she was not permitted to want that." She opened the clasp. She took out the letter. She told herself she wasn't going to read it. She read it. Cecilia's handwriting was familiar, looping, slightly rushed, the letters of a woman who thought faster than she wrote. James, I have started this letter 11 times. I will try to finish it this once. I cannot marry you. I know that is not what you are expecting to read, and I know it will hurt you, and I am sorry for that more than I can properly say. You are a good man. I have always thought so. I think so still. But I have known for some time that what I feel for you is not what you deserve to be felt. I am fond of you. I admire you. I would have been, I think, a loyal wife. But I would have been a wife who spent her whole life being fond and admiring and loyal, and you would have spent your whole life knowing it was not quite enough, and I cannot do that to you. There is someone who would not make you feel that way. I have watched her all my life, and I know how she thinks, and I know what she is worth, and I know she is everything I am not quite enough of. She is afraid you wouldn't look at her properly if you knew she was an option. She is probably right. You would have to find her on your own. Her name is Elizabeth. She is the other one. The one they always introduce second. Look at her properly, James. I never could make you. See, Elizabeth sat very still. The fire had burned low. The room was cold. She read the letter again, then a third time. She is the other one. The one they always introduce second. Cecilia had known. Not just known, had written it down, had sealed it, had meant to send it, had not sent it. And somehow the letter had ended up in a bag in a carriage that had brought Elizabeth here to this house, wearing Cecilia's dress, carrying Cecilia's name like a borrowed coat. She did not know whether to laugh or weep. She did neither. She folded the letter with great care, placed it back in the envelope and put it in the drawer. Then she lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man in a library who had noticed she was afraid of horses and had not tried to manage her around it. And she thought, I cannot tell him. And then, I cannot not tell him. And then, for a long time, nothing at all. The letter from her father arrived on a Tuesday. Elizabeth knew what it was before she opened it. She recognized the handwriting, the particular heaviness of the seal. Her father pressed too hard, always had, as though the wax needed to be punished into submission. She took it from the salver at breakfast, excused herself before the Duke could notice her expression, and read it standing in the corridor outside the dining room like a person who had been expecting bad news and had simply been waiting to find out what shape it would take. It was brief. Her father's letters were always brief. He considered elaboration a form of weakness. The Harrington debt comes due at the end of the month. I have managed Alcott and the others, but Harrington will not be moved. You know what is needed. Do not waste time on sentiment. She folded it, put it in her pocket, stood very still in the corridor for a moment, listening to the sound of the Duke's cup being set down in the dining room, the rustle of his newspaper, the ordinary sounds of a man who did not know that someone in his house was trying to calculate the price of him. She went upstairs and did not come down until she was certain her face was her own again. She avoided him that morning. It was not difficult. The manor was large enough that avoidance required only intention, not effort. She walked in the garden until the cold made staying there unreasonable, then sat in the small sitting room off the east corridor that nobody seemed to use, and read without reading and thought without concluding anything useful. She needed a proposal. She needed it within, she counted, 18 days. From a man who did not know her real name, who thought she was visiting as a family connection, who had, as far as she could tell, no particular intention of marrying anyone, let alone a woman he had met less than a week ago. She pressed her fingers to her eyes. The thing was, and this was the part she could not afford to examine too closely, she did not want it this way. She had understood, coming here, that the entire endeavor was dishonest. She had made her peace with dishonesty as a survival strategy before, when survival left no better options. But she had not expected to sit in his library for 4 mornings in a row. She had not expected the conversation about duty and loyalty. She had not expected a man who noticed things, who saw her flinch at the stables and did not make a spectacle of it, who listened when she spoke as though her words had weight. She had not expected to like him. And now she was sitting in an unused sitting room calculating how to get a marriage proposal out of him before the end of the month, and the thought made her feel ill in a way that surprised her with its intensity. Do not waste time on sentiment. Her father's voice. Always useful. Always horrible. She put the book down and went to find something practical to do. She was in the library that afternoon, not reading, just present, because it was the room that felt most like neutral ground, when the Duke came in earlier than usual. He looked tired, not the polished tiredness of a man who had slept badly, but something deeper, the kind that lives in the eyes and has nothing to do with sleep. He sat in his usual chair, did not open a book. Elizabeth waited. "I had a letter today," he said finally, not to her exactly, more to the room, from Cecilia's father. Elizabeth went very still. He wanted to express his condolences, belatedly. The Duke's voice was even, uninflected, a year and a half after the fact. Perhaps he found it difficult to write. Perhaps he looked at the fire, or perhaps he wanted something. The silence stretched. "Did he?" Elizabeth asked carefully. "He asked whether I had given any thought to," he stopped, rearranged whatever he had been about to say. "He was fishing. It doesn't matter for what." He glanced at her then. "Forgive me, I don't know why I'm telling you this." "Because you needed to say it to someone who wasn't on his side." It came out more directly than she intended, but she did not take it back. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." They sat quietly for a while after that. Elizabeth picked up her book. The Duke eventually picked up his. The fire burned steadily, and outside the windows the light began to fail, the way it did in October, not gradually, but all at once, as though the sky had simply decided it was done. "Can I ask you something?" the Duke said. Elizabeth looked up. "You can ask." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but its first cousin. Cecilia never said that. She always said of course, and then answered whatever she liked and deflected everything else with perfect grace. "I'm not Cecilia," Elizabeth said. The words landed in the room and stayed there. She had not meant them to mean what they meant. Or rather, she had not meant to say them at all, and now she had, and there they were, sitting between them, quietly enormous. The Duke said slowly, "No, you're not." He said it without accusation, without any particular expression she could read. He said it as though he were confirming something he had been thinking for some time. Elizabeth made herself hold his gaze. "What did you want to ask?" she said. A pause. He seemed to decide something. "Why did you come here?" The question was direct and entirely fair, and she had no answer that was not either a lie or a confession. "My father thought it would be beneficial," she said, "for the family connection." "Your father," he said it neutrally. "Yes, I imagine he did." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. "Your Grace." "James," he said. She stopped. "We have been sitting in this library together every morning for 5 days," he said. "I think you can manage James." The unexpected simplicity of it, the ordinariness, the almost ordinary warmth of it caught her entirely off guard. "Elizabeth," she said before she thought about it. He nodded, as though it were settled, as though names were simple things that people exchanged without consequence. She looked back at her book. Her heart was doing something she was not going to acknowledge. She found him that evening standing at the window of the drawing room in the dark, not reading, not doing anything, just standing and looking out at the grounds in a way that made her stop in the doorway and consider retreating without being seen. She was not quick enough. "Come in," he said without turning. "Unless you'd rather not." She came in. She sat in the chair nearest the door, which felt honest. He stayed at the window. After a moment he said, still looking out, "She ended the engagement by letter." Elizabeth did not speak. "I had been in the country for 3 weeks, estate business. I came back and there was a letter. She had found someone else," it said. A pause. "I didn't believe it. I had seen her a month before that and there was no one, but she didn't answer my reply." And then he stopped. "And then she was gone." The fire crackled. "I never knew why," he said quietly. "I've spent a year and a half not knowing why. Elizabeth thought of the letter in the drawer upstairs. I cannot marry you. You would have spent your whole life knowing it was not quite enough. She thought, he deserves to know. She thought, if I tell him, I have to tell him all of it. She thought, I cannot tell him all of it yet. Perhaps, Elizabeth said carefully, she thought she was doing you a kindness. He turned from the window, looked at her across the dim room. That's a very specific thing to say. It's a very common reason. He studied her for a moment. Then, did she talk to you about it? The question was quiet and direct and landed in her chest like a stone in water. Not directly, Elizabeth said, which was true. He nodded slowly, turned back to the window. I keep thinking, he said, that if I had just come back sooner or written more, or he stopped himself. Forgive me, this is not appropriate conversation. You said that about the wrong things, Elizabeth said. Again, he looked at her. You keep apologizing for saying true things, she said, and not apologizing for the things that actually warrant it. A beat. What things warrant it? I don't know yet, she said, but I'll tell you when I find them. For the first time, the first real time, unguarded and unmanaged, he smiled. It was brief. It changed his face entirely. Elizabeth looked away before it could do any more damage. She went upstairs. She took the letter from the drawer. She sat on the edge of the bed and held it and told herself she would wait. She would find the right moment. She would find a way to tell him that was not a catastrophe. Then her father's letter fell out of her pocket onto the floor. Do not waste time on sentiment. She put both letters in the drawer. She did not sleep for a very long time. Her father arrived on a Thursday. Elizabeth had not been warned. That was, she understood immediately, intentional. A warning would have given her time to prepare, to position herself, to manage the introduction, to control what happened in what order. Her father did not like variables. He had not introduced himself. She was in the library when she heard the carriage on the drive. She was at the window when she saw him step out. She was already moving toward the door when she heard Mrs. Holt's voice in the hall, and her father's voice answering, and then the Duke's voice. He must have come from the study, low and courteous, doing what well-bred men do when unexpected guests arrive, which is to make it seem as though the inconvenience is a pleasure. She slowed at the top of the stairs. Her father was in the entrance hall below, hat in hand, smiling the particular smile he used on people he needed something from. The Duke stood opposite him. And for one suspended moment, Elizabeth stood on the landing and looked at the two of them together and understood, with total clarity, that the next few minutes were going to determine everything. She came down the stairs. Her father looked up and saw her. His smile didn't change. That was the thing about her father. The smile was not connected to anything real, so nothing real could alter it. There she is, he said warmly. Elizabeth came to stand beside the Duke. She felt, rather than saw, him glance at her. Father, she said, I wasn't expecting you. I was passing through the county. He wasn't. Her father never passed through anywhere. He arrived places with intention always. I thought I'd look in, make sure you were comfortable. He turned to the Duke with the air of a man bestowing a great favor. I hope she hasn't been any trouble, Your Grace. She can be a brief, affectionate pause that was neither brief nor affectionate, particular. Miss Ashwood has been excellent company, the Duke said. Miss Ashwood, her father repeated, and something in his tone shifted, the faintest flicker of satisfaction. Yes, she's a good girl. Elizabeth watched the Duke's face. Nothing, she breathed. They moved to the drawing room. Tea was brought. Her father talked. He was good at talking, at filling a room with the impression of warmth and ease while extracting whatever he had come to extract. He asked about the estate. He admired the furnishings. He made two careful references to the family's long connection to the Wexford name, neither of which was entirely accurate. Elizabeth sat and said very little and watched the clock. It happened in the 47th minute. Her father had been telling a story, something from Elizabeth's childhood, one of the ones he deployed to make her seem charming in retrospect, harmless and slightly funny, the kind of story that required her to have been a particular kind of child in a particular kind of family. He was midway through it when he turned to her, gesturing for effect, and said, You remember, Cecilia, he caught himself. 1 second, perhaps less. Elizabeth, he corrected smoothly, without missing a beat. Already moving on, you remember how your mother used to say, but the Duke had gone very still. Elizabeth saw it happen. She watched the stillness move through him the way cold moves through water from the outside in, slow and total. His hand, which had been resting on the arm of his chair, did not move. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes he looked at her. Not quickly, not accusingly. He simply turned his head and looked at her with the full, unhurried attention of a man who has just understood something and is taking a moment to understand it completely. Elizabeth held his gaze. She did not look away. There was no point in looking away. Her father was still talking. He had not noticed. He was too absorbed in his own performance to see what had just occurred 3 feet to his left, that a careful, year-long architecture of half-truths had just developed a crack wide enough to see through. Elizabeth looked at James Wexford and thought, there it is. He looked back at her and said nothing. For the rest of the visit, another 20 minutes, interminable, he was perfectly courteous. He asked her father appropriate questions. He offered more tea. He saw him to his carriage with the impeccable manners of a man who had been raised to make exits as graceful as entrances. Elizabeth stood in the drawing room and waited. She heard the carriage leave. She heard his footsteps in the hall. She heard them stop outside the drawing room door. He came in. He did not sit. He stood near the fireplace and looked at her across the room, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then, "How long were you going to keep this up?" His voice was even. Not cold, not angry, something more controlled than either. The voice of a man keeping a very firm hand on something that would rather not be kept. "I don't know," Elizabeth said. It was the only honest answer. "Did you know about the letter?" The question arrived like a change in weather, sudden, total, impossible to prepare for. She had thought in the abstract about this moment. She had run through versions of it in the dark of her room on nights when sleep wouldn't come. She had imagined herself saying something measured, something that provided context before confession, something that made the shape of it comprehensible before he had to feel it. Instead, she said, "Yes," 1 word, no architecture around it. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Did you read it?" The fire crackled. Outside the window a bird called once and went silent. "Yes," she said again. He turned away from her, looked at the fireplace. A long silence settled in the room, not the comfortable silence of the library, not the companionable quiet of 2 people who had found an unexpected ease with each other, but something heavier and less forgiving. "You came here knowing," he said. "I came here not knowing what was in it." She kept her voice steady. "I found it in the carriage. I didn't read it until later." "But you read it." "Yes." "And you said nothing." She did not answer that. There was no answer that was not an admission of something she was not yet certain how to defend. He turned back to face her. His expression was she searched for the word contained. That was it. The way a house looks when all the shutters are closed. "Why did you come here?" he said. "The real reason." Elizabeth had rehearsed a version of this conversation in which she managed the information, in which she gave him the shape of the truth without the worst of it, in which her father's debts and her own culpability were framed as circumstances rather than calculation. She looked at him and understood that she was not going to do any of that. "My father needed a proposal," she said, "before the end of the month. He has debts that require resolution. He thought if I came here under the family connection, and if you—" She stopped, made herself continue. "He thought I looked enough like Cecilia that you might not ask too many questions." The silence that followed was the worst kind. Not shocked, he had already suspected, she could see that, but the silence of something being confirmed that a person had hoped would not be confirmed. "Near enough," he said quietly. She flinched. He had heard that then, in the hall the first day. He had heard all of it. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, slowly, as though completing a thought. Then he said, "You should leave in the morning." He said it without cruelty. That was almost worse, that there was no anger in it, only a door closing with great and deliberate care. He walked out of the room. Elizabeth stood by the window and listened to his footsteps until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she sat down. She did not cry. She was not sure what she felt was the kind of thing that resolved into tears. It was bigger than that and less defined, the feeling of having lost something she had not been entitled to want in the first place, which is its own particular species of grief. She sat for a long time. Then she went upstairs and told her maid to begin packing. At midnight she was still awake. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the letter in the drawer. She is the one worth waiting for. She thought about a man who had put a framed no. She didn't know that. She had no idea what he had done with Cecilia's letter. She had assumed he'd never received it. She had assumed too many things. She had been operating on assumptions from the beginning, and look where it had gotten her. She thought about her father in that carriage, satisfied, heading back to whatever negotiation he was conducting with whatever creditor was currently most threatening, not knowing and not caring what he had destroyed in 47 minutes of drawing-room conversation. She thought about 18 days, 14 now. She thought about James Wexford's face when he smiled, the brevity of it, how it changed him, how she had looked away because she couldn't afford not to. She closed her eyes. You should leave in the morning. She would leave in the morning. She would go back to Derbyshire and her father's house and the slow diminishment of a life lived in the margins of other people's stories. And that was the correct and reasonable outcome of having agreed to something dishonest, and she had known that coming in. She had known that coming in. She opened her eyes. She reached into the drawer and took out Cecilia's letter and held it in the dark without reading it, because she knew it by heart now, every word including the last ones. Look at her properly, James. I never could make you. She put it back. She did not sleep. She was packed by 6. It was an hour earlier than necessary, which meant she had an hour to sit in a room that was mostly empty now. Her things back in their trunks, Cecilia's bag on top of the largest one, the drawer of the bedside table standing open and bare, and be very calm about everything. She was extremely calm. She sat on the edge of the stripped bed and folded her hands in her lap, and was so calm that her hands were shaking slightly, which she decided not to notice. Her maid, Clara, moved around her quietly in the way of a woman who understood that the situation called for silence. Clara had been with Elizabeth for 6 years. She asked no questions. She packed with great efficiency and a carefully neutral expression, and only once, when she thought Elizabeth wasn't looking, did she glance over with something in her eyes that might have been sympathy or might have been the particular sorrow of a woman who has watched someone lose something and been unable to do anything about it. Elizabeth looked out the window. The grounds were gray in the early light, the elm trees still and dark against a sky that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it intended to be. Somewhere out there, she couldn't see from this angle, were the stables. She thought about that afternoon, the walk around the hedge, his voice saying, "I was asking about you," without any edge to it, just attention, just the uncomplicated act of seeing her rather than through her. She looked away from the window. 6:47. She had 13 minutes before the carriage would be brought around. She heard the knock at 7:15. Not the door to her room, the sound came from further down the corridor, muffled, directional. A door opening, footsteps. Then Mrs. Holt's voice, low, and another voice answering, and then silence. Elizabeth stood. She did not know why she stood. There was nothing to stand for. She was leaving in, she checked, 8 minutes, and whatever was happening in the corridor had nothing to do with her. She sat back down, stood up again, went to the door and opened it. The corridor was empty, but Mrs. Holt was at the far end of it, moving toward the back stairs, and she turned when she heard Elizabeth's door and stopped. They looked at each other across the length of the corridor. Mrs. Holt came back. She stopped a few feet away and folded her hands in front of her, and looked at Elizabeth with the expression of a woman who has been in service for 31 years, and has therefore witnessed most of what human beings are capable of, and has opinions about very little of it anymore, except the things that matter. He's gone to the stables, Mrs. Holt said. Elizabeth said nothing. He went out at 5. He does that when he can't sleep. A pause. He didn't sleep. Mrs. Holt. He put the letter on the mantelpiece, the housekeeper said. In his study. Miss Ashwood's letter, your sister's letter, forgive me. I saw it this morning when I went in to lay the fire. Elizabeth went very still. He framed it, Mrs. Holt said. The words didn't make sense for a moment. Elizabeth turned them over, examined them, put them down and picked them up again. Why would he? She stopped. It was a rejection. Yes, Mrs. Holt said it simply. Not as a contradiction, just as a confirmation. As though the fact that it was a rejection and the fact that he had framed it were not in conflict at all. I don't understand. Mrs. Holt looked at her for a moment, then she said. There was more to the letter. Elizabeth heard her own heartbeat. I beg your pardon. The last lines. The housekeeper's voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone delivering information they know will matter. The ink had run on your copy, the one in the bag, she paused. The original was sent, Miss Ashwood, not by your sister. She gave it to her lady's maid to post the day before she took ill. It arrived here 6 weeks after. Another pause, shorter. After she was gone. Elizabeth put one hand on the doorframe. He received it, she said. He received it. In the last lines, Mrs. Holt reached into her apron pocket, took out a small folded paper, not the letter itself, something copied. Elizabeth could see it was the housekeeper's own handwriting, careful and upright. I thought you might want to see, Mrs. Holt said, before you left. Elizabeth took it. She unfolded it. The copied lines were short, 8 sentences in Mrs. Holt's careful hand, and below them a note, as written in the original, received November 1841. Elizabeth read them. Then she read them again. I know you will think this is my way of softening what I have done. It isn't. I have watched her all my life, and I know what she is, which is this. She is the truest person I have ever known. She says what she means. She means what she says. She does not know how to be less than she is, even when lesser would be easier. She is the one worth waiting for. I was just the one who arrived first. Her name is Elizabeth. She is the other one, the one they always introduce second. Look at her properly, James. I never could make you. Elizabeth stood in the corridor for a long time. The paper was very light in her hands. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked and a fire settled, and the ordinary sounds of morning moved through the rooms as though nothing particular was happening. She thought about Cecilia writing those lines. Cecilia, who had known, who had always known, who had broken her own engagement, not because she had found someone else, which had never been true, but because she had looked at James Wexford and understood that fond was not enough, that loyal was not enough, that a marriage built on nearly would make them both smaller over time. And who had looked at Elizabeth, quiet, particular, always second, always nearly, and seen something that Elizabeth had never managed to see in herself. She thought about a man who had received this letter 6 weeks after Cecilia died, who had read it alone in this house, already grieving, who had read Look at Her properly about a woman he had never met, written by a woman he had just lost, and had somehow framed it and put it on his mantelpiece, not as a memorial, as a reminder. She folded the paper very carefully and put it in her pocket. Thank you, Mrs. Holt, she said. Mrs. Holt nodded. Then, with the quiet precision of a woman who has said exactly what she intended, the stables are past the east garden, through the gate in the wall. He'll be with the gray mare he usually is when he's thinking. She turned and went back down the corridor. Elizabeth stood at her open door and looked at her packed trunks and the empty drawer in Cecilia's bag sitting on top of the largest trunk. And then she looked at the door at the end of the corridor, and then she looked at her hands, not shaking anymore. The east garden was cold and gray and smelled of wet stone and the last of the autumn roses, brown at the edges now, holding on past their season with a stubbornness she found she respected. The gate in the wall was iron, heavy, the kind that requires intention to open. She opened it. The stables were ahead of her across a stretch of gravel, and she could hear, even from here, the low sounds of horses, the exhale, the shift, the small comfortable noises of large animals in warm spaces. Her feet slowed without her permission. She made them continue. She stopped at the stable door. Inside, in the third stall down, the Duke of Wexford stood with his back to her, one hand on the neck of a gray mare who was regarding him with the patient affection of an animal who is used to being visited in the early hours by someone who needs somewhere to stand. He hadn't heard her. She could still leave. The carriage would be ready. Clara would have brought the trunks down. In 3 hours she could be 20 miles from here, and in 3 days she could be home, and in 3 weeks this could be the kind of thing that had happened to someone else in another life, before the one she was going to have to build from whatever materials remained. She could still leave. She took the copied letter from her pocket. She stepped inside. He heard her footsteps on the stable floor. He didn't turn immediately. His hand stayed on the mare's neck, one slow stroke, and then he went still in the way of a person who has recognized something, a sound, a presence, and is taking a moment before they have to deal with what it means. Then he turned. He looked at her across the length of the stable. She was standing just inside the door, the cold light behind her, still in her traveling clothes. She noticed him notice that, the small confirmation that she had been leaving, that she had packed and prepared and come here anyway. Neither of them spoke. The mare shifted in her stall. Outside, a bird started and stopped. Elizabeth walked toward him. She stopped when she was close enough that there was no question of accident, no possibility of this being anything other than deliberate. She held out the folded paper, Mrs. Holt's copy, 8 lines in careful upright handwriting, and kept her eyes on his face. He looked at the paper, then at her. He took it. She watched him read it. She had the advantage, this time, of knowing what was in it. She could watch his face instead of the words, could see the moment he reached the last lines, the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible exhale. He refolded it, did not hand it back. "You read the whole thing," he said. "I did." The copy in the bag, the ink had run. "Yes, I didn't know there was more." She paused. "Mrs. Holt showed me." He nodded, once, looking at the paper in his hands. "And you still almost left," he said quietly. "I did almost leave." "What stopped you?" She considered giving him something careful, something measured and defensible, the kind of answer that kept a person at a safe remove from the thing they actually meant. "You framed it," she said instead. He looked up. "A rejection," she said, "from a woman who had just ended your engagement. You received it after she died, and you put it in a frame and kept it in your study." She held his gaze. "I needed to know why." A long silence. The mare exhaled softly behind him. "Because she was right," he said, simple, unadorned, the way he said things when he had decided to say them properly. "About which part?" Elizabeth asked. "All of it." He looked at the paper again briefly, then back at her. "I spent a year and a half believing she had left me for someone else. I was angry. Then I was not angry, and that was worse. And then this arrived," he indicated the paper, "and I read it, and I understood that she had not left me for someone else at all. She had left me because she knew," a pause, "that what we had was fond. That fond is not enough." "She knew before you did," Elizabeth said. "She was always clearer than I was." Something moved across his face, not grief exactly, but the older, quieter thing that grief becomes when you have made a kind of peace with it. She was also right about the other thing. Elizabeth waited. "I would not have looked at you," he said. "If I had known from the beginning, if your father had written and said I have another daughter, may she visit, I would have said no. I was not looking. I had decided very thoroughly that I was done with looking. And now," he was quiet for a moment, "now I have spent 10 days sitting in a library with a woman who argues about duty and loyalty and tells me when I'm apologizing for the wrong things." A pause. "And who came to my stable at 7 in the morning in her traveling clothes rather than simply leaving." "I nearly simply left." "But you didn't." "No." He took one step toward her. Just one, enough to close half the distance between them, enough to make the space feel different, smaller and more deliberate. Your father's debts, he said. She stiffened. I want to deal with that separately, he said. Not as a condition, not as a negotiation. Separately because it has nothing to do with what I'm about to say, and I need you to understand that before I say it. Elizabeth looked at him carefully. What are you about to say? I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer it the way you answer things, which is directly and without managing me. I've been known to manage. Less than you think. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite the smile, the precursor to it, the shape the smile borrowed from. Elizabeth. Her name, just her name, the way he had said it in the library, settled, as though it fit the room. Yes, she said. I know that's not an answer to a question. I haven't asked yet. No, she agreed, but it will be. He went very still. She watched understanding move through him, slow, then certain, the way dawn works, not a moment but a process, light arriving before you can point to where it came from. You're certain, he said. I'm particular, she said. You were told that at the outset. Particular people don't say yes to things they're not certain of. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I haven't asked yet. I know. I'm going to ask properly. I assumed you would. Elizabeth. He said it differently this time, not settled but careful, the way you carry something you don't want to drop. Will you? Yes, she said. I hadn't finished. I know what you're asking. You might be wrong. I'm not wrong, a beat too. No, he said quietly, you're not. And then he did something she had not expected, which was that he laughed, brief and low and entirely real, the laugh of a man who has been very serious for a very long time and has suddenly, unexpectedly, been given a reason not to be. It changed his face completely. Elizabeth had looked away the last time. She did not look away this time. They walked back to the house through the east garden. Not touching, not yet. That would come later in the correct order, with the correct forms observed, because some forms existed for good reasons and they both understood that. But close. Close enough that the distance between them was a choice rather than a default. At the gate in the wall he stopped and held it open for her, and she passed through, and then he said behind her. Your father, she turned. I'll deal with Harrington directly, James said, and Alcott, and whoever else there is. He said it without drama, the way he dealt with estate matters practically, with the efficiency of a man for whom problems were things to be solved rather than suffered. I'll do it today. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He looked at her steadily. I want it done before the end of the week. I want there to be no question afterward of what my reasons were. Elizabeth understood. He was removing the debt from the equation entirely, not as a gift to her father but as a gift to her, so that she would never have to wonder, so that no one else could say it either. She thought about her father receiving that news, the careful satisfaction he would feel, the belief that his plan had worked, that he had maneuvered this outcome into existence. He'll think he arranged it, she said. Let him, James said. We'll know. She looked at him, at the gray morning light on his face and the absolute steadiness of his expression, and the fact that he had been in this stable at 5 in the morning because he couldn't sleep, and she thought about what Cecilia had written, the truest person I have ever known, and thought. She was writing about herself too in the end. It takes one to know one. We'll know, she agreed. Inside, Mrs. Holt was in the entrance hall with the expression of a woman who had not been waiting, and had simply happened to be there. She looked at Elizabeth, then at the Duke, then at the fact of them arriving through the same door at the same time from the direction of the east garden. Shall I have breakfast delayed, Your Grace? She said. By an hour, James said. We have some things to discuss. Very good. Mrs. Holt turned toward the kitchen corridor, and Elizabeth could not be certain. The angle was wrong, the light was poor, but she thought she saw the corner of the housekeeper's mouth move. Mrs. Holt, Elizabeth said. The housekeeper turned. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, "for this morning." Mrs. Holt looked at her for a moment with those kind, 31 years eyes. "Your sister was a good woman, Miss Ashwood," she said. "She knew what she was doing. She went to delay breakfast." Elizabeth stood in the entrance hall and thought about Cecilia, about a woman who had loved well but not quite right, and had known the difference, and had been honest about it when dishonesty would have been so much easier, who had written a letter she was afraid to send and sent it anyway, through a maid in the end, because she knew herself well enough to know she would lose her nerve if she tried to do it directly, who had written her sister's name into that letter like a door left open. Look at her properly. "I never could make you." She had made him in the end, just not in the way she'd planned. Clara appeared at the top of the stairs with the expression of a woman, standing next to packed trunks and requiring direction. "Clara," Elizabeth called up. "Miss." "Unpack, please." A pause, then with great and careful neutrality, "Yes, Miss Ashwood." Elizabeth turned. James was watching her from the doorway of the drawing room. He had his hands in his pockets and his shoulder against the doorframe, and he was looking at her with the full, unhurried attention she had come to recognize. The look that meant he was not performing anything, not managing anything, just seeing. "Breakfast in an hour," he said. "I'll be there in 50 minutes, she said. "I have a letter to write." "To your father?" "To my father," he nodded. "Tell him the debt is settled." "I'll tell him rather more than that," she said. Something moved in his eyes, warmth, she thought, or the beginning of it, the first real warmth of a thing that was going to grow considerably. "I don't doubt it," he said. Elizabeth went upstairs. She sat at the small writing desk in her room, she thought, because it was now, and took out a sheet of paper and wrote her father a letter that was not brief and was not kind and was not any of the things his letters to her had always been. It was honest. It was complete. It had no missing lines. The anniversary fell on a Tuesday. Elizabeth noticed it the way she noticed most things now, not with the braced, careful attention of a woman managing herself through something difficult, but with the open, unguarded awareness of someone who had learned, slowly and with some effort, that paying attention to the good things was not a form of tempting fate. 1 year. She was in the library when she realized it, not because she had been counting, she hadn't, not consciously, but because the light through the tall windows was exactly the same as it had been that first morning, that particular flat October light that couldn't decide between gray and gold and settled for both, and she had looked up from her book and the light had told her. She sat with it for a moment. Then she got up and went to find James. He was in the study. He was always in the study in the mornings, which she had initially found inconvenient and had come to find, in the way of things that are reliable, quietly comforting. She knocked twice, their knock, the one that meant it's me and I'm coming in, and opened the door without waiting. He looked up from his correspondence. She crossed the room, sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair she had claimed as hers through repeated occupation, in the same way she had claimed various other things in Wexford Manor through the simple force of being consistently, unapologetically present, and looked at him. He looked back. "What's happened?" he said. "Nothing's happened." "You have your something has happened face." "I have one face," she said. "You've simply learned to read it." That took approximately 4 days. He set down his pen. "What is it?" "It's been a year," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, slow, the way he did when he was feeling something that he was going to take care with. "It has," he said. They looked at each other across the desk and the morning and the year that had accumulated between them, the arguments and the silences, and the long evenings in the library and the cold mornings, and one very memorable disagreement about the Northfield drainage that had lasted 3 days and ended, as their disagreements generally did, in a draw that satisfied neither of them and amused both. "I want to visit her," Elizabeth said, "today if you'll come." "Of course," he said, as though it required no consideration at all. Cecilia was buried in the churchyard at Ashworth, which was 3 hours from Wexford Manor and had therefore, until this year, been the kind of journey Elizabeth made alone or not at all. She had not made it alone this time. James had come in November and in March and now in October, and each time he had stood beside her at the grave with his hands clasped behind his back and said very little, because he understood, had always understood. She thought from the very beginning that some presences are not about words. Today was no different. The churchyard was quiet. The sky was doing the same thing it did everywhere in October, that flat gold and gray indecision, and the grass was wet, and the air smelled of stone and leaves, and the particular cold that comes before winter makes up its mind. Elizabeth stood at the grave and thought about many things, none of them entirely linear. She thought about a pink dress in a carriage and a bag with a tarnished clasp, and a letter with missing lines. She thought about a man who had framed a rejection and kept it on his mantelpiece as a reminder of something he had not known yet how to want. She thought about Mrs. Holt's careful handwriting and an iron gate in a garden wall, and the sound of a laugh she had not expected, brief and low and entirely real. She thought about Cecilia writing 11 beginnings of a letter before she finished it. She thought about what it had cost her sister to be honest, to look at her own life clearly and say, "This is fond, and fond is not enough, and I cannot pretend otherwise." To look at a man she admired and say, "You deserve better than what I have to give." To write her sister's name into a letter not knowing whether it would matter, not knowing whether it would ever be read, not knowing whether the door she was leaving open would ever be walked through. That was the thing about Cecilia. She had done brave things quietly, without witness, without any guarantee of outcome. Elizabeth thought she had perhaps underestimated her sister her entire life. She crouched and placed the white roses, Cecilia's, always at the base of the stone, stood up. James was beside her, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, which was as much as either of them did in public and was, she had come to understand, exactly enough. "Do you think she knew?" Elizabeth said. Not for the first time. She had asked it before in different rooms at different hours, turning the question over like a stone to see what lived under it. James was quiet for a moment. He looked at the grave with the steady, unhurried attention he gave everything that mattered to him. "She always knew," he said. "That's why she didn't send the letter herself. She knew I had to find you on my own." Elizabeth considered this. "She sent it through her maid," she said. 6 weeks later, that's not quite leaving it to fate." "No," James agreed. "She left it to the postal service, which is marginally more reliable." A pause. "She prepared the ground, she just didn't plant the seed herself." Elizabeth looked at the gravestone. At Cecilia's name in the stone, the dates beneath it, the modest, honest simplicity of it. Cecilia had never wanted anything elaborate. "She would have been insufferable about it," Elizabeth said. "If she'd lived, she would have taken credit at every opportunity." "Completely," James said. "She would have told the story at every dinner party for the rest of her life. She would have embellished it. Significantly. Added details that weren't there. Made herself more central than she already was." He paused, "which is saying something." Elizabeth laughed. "It came out freely. No management, no calculation, just the clean, uncomplicated sound of something genuinely funny in a place that held genuine grief, which was, she had learned this year, not a contradiction. You could stand at a grave and laugh. The person in it, if they had been the right kind of person, would have wanted you to. Cecilia had been the right kind of person. James looked at her when she laughed. He did that, noticed it, marked it, gave it his full attention as though it were something worth recording. She had stopped looking away when he did it. "Come on," he said, "it's cold." "It's October." "Yes, and you've been standing in it for 20 minutes. I'm particular about fresh air." "You're particular about everything," he said, which was true, and which he said the way you say things that are true and that you have decided to enjoy rather than manage. They walked back through the churchyard. The gate was iron, heavy, the kind that required intention. He held it open. She passed through. In the carriage on the way home she fell asleep somewhere past the second hour, which she would have considered undignified a year ago, and had since revised her position on, because some dignities were less useful than they appeared, and sleep in a moving carriage was not one of the things worth performing alertness for. She woke when the carriage slowed on the Wexford Drive. James was reading. He had at some point put his coat over her, which she had not asked for, and which she was not going to comment on because commenting on it would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would make it smaller somehow, would reduce it from the thing it actually was, which was the quiet, daily, undemonstrative constancy of a man who noticed what people needed and provided it without requiring credit. She sat up. He looked over. "We're back," he said. "I can see that," she said. "You snore slightly." "I absolutely do not." "It's very quiet," he said, "almost imperceptible. I only mention it because I find it." "Do not finish that sentence." "Reassuring," he finished. She looked at him, he looked back. Outside the window, the elm trees lined the drive the way they always did, standing in whatever light was available with the patient indifference of things that have been there long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything. The carriage stopped. The door opened. Wexford Manor stood at the end of the drive in the October light, enormous, serious, every room looking as though it were waiting for something important to happen, and Elizabeth stepped out and looked up at it and thought, "Mine." Not in the way of acquisition, not in the way her father thought about things. In the way of belonging, the way you belong to a place that has let you into it, that has shown you its grief and its silences, and its white flowers and its housekeeper who keeps copies of important letters, and its library that smells of books that have been read rather than displayed, and has made room for you without requiring you to be anyone other than what you are. James came to stand beside her. They stood looking at the house for a moment, the way people stand and look at things they have come to love. "Next year," Elizabeth said, "I'd like to plant something in the East Garden." "What sort of something?" "Roses," she paused, "white ones." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "all right." They went inside. That evening after dinner, Elizabeth went to the study. She did not knock. She came in and crossed to the mantelpiece and stood before it and looked at what was framed there, Cecilia's letter, the original, the handwriting she would have known anywhere, the ink slightly faded now from a year of firelight. She read the last lines. "She is the one worth waiting for. I was just the one who arrived first. Her name is Elizabeth. She is the other one, the one they always introduce second. Look at her properly, James. I never could make you." She stood there for a while. James came in behind her. She heard him, recognized his step without needing to turn, and he came to stand beside her, and they both looked at the letter in its frame on the mantelpiece. "Thank you," Elizabeth said. "For what?" "For keeping it." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I wasn't keeping it for sentiment." "I know. I was keeping it because she asked me to do something," he said, "and I wanted to remember whether I'd done it." Elizabeth turned and looked at him. "Had you," she said, "done it?" He looked back at her with the full, unhurried, unmanaged attention she had come to know as well as her own name. Better, perhaps, because it was still new enough to feel like something, still carried the small shock of being seen by someone who had looked and not looked away. "Yes," he said simply. The other one he had thought once in this house in that first week, before he had known her name or her laugh or the particular way she went still when she was thinking. The other one. He did not think that anymore. He thought, Elizabeth. Just that. Just her name, which was its own complete thing, which required no qualification or comparison or context, which did not need to be introduced second to anything. Just Elizabeth. Which was, she had always been, entirely enough. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.